Buddhism denies the soul. Without self, what reincarnates? Chapter 1. The notion of self, soul in idealistic religions. Human perspectives on existence are divided into two main views, materialistic and idealistic. The materialistic view, supported by many scientists, asserts that humans are a combination of matter and consciousness is a product of brain activity. According to materialism, consciousness is impermanent and there is no existence of a spiritual world. When brain cells die, consciousness also ceases, and there is no transmission from the deceased to a new body in the next life. In summary, death is the end. In contrast, idealistic religions believe that each person has an eternal soul residing in the body. When the body dissolves, this soul exits and either reincarnates into a new body or merges into a spiritual world. These religions also believe in an eternal spiritual world called God, the Great Self, or the Creator, depending on the religion. The soul is seen as the master, owner, and controller of the body and mind. This concept of the soul is the idea of the self, known as Atman in Sanskrit, which is self-born and never perishes, called the true self or ego. For religions like Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, humans were created by God, with Adam and Eve as the first humans. God breathed life into the clay-formed body, meaning he breathed his soul into that body. The soul in humans is the part of God within each person. The story of humans and paradise in the Old Testament, if understood metaphorically, suggests that the soul God breathed into each person is pure and holy, the direct, non-conceptual, non-verbal, non-discriminative knowing present at birth. Humans living in the world acquire knowledge with concepts and discrimination through learning and experience, which pollutes the soul with evil and unwholesome qualities. When a person dies, if the worldly knowledge is left behind, the untainted soul returns to merge with God. If the soul cannot escape the worldly pollution, it will be condemned to hell. Brahmanism believes in a great self, Brahman, that pervades the entire universe. Each being has a small self, Atman, that controls the body and mind. The small self creates karma and undergoes reincarnation, experiencing different bodies and suffering within the cycle of samsara. When the small self practices to permanently escape the body and merge with the great self, that is nirvana, liberation. Jainism, a non-theistic religion contemporary to Buddhism, does not advocate for a great self or almighty God, but still believes in a soul that controls the body, bound by karma. This soul undergoes reincarnation and suffering from one body to another. Jainism advocates ascetic practice to pay off karma, so the soul becomes omniscient, omnipotent, holy, escaping the prison of the body, achieving total freedom. Taoism believes in an entity called the Tao, which is formless and shapeless, the essence of the universe from which heaven, earth, and all things emanate. The Tao pervades and imbues every speck of dust, similar to the Great Self or Almighty God of idealistic religions, only differing in terminology. Taoism advocates practice to achieve merging with the light and blending with the dust, meaning merging with the Tao, the essence of the phenomenal world. Mahayana Buddhism advocates for a pure, eternal, undying Buddha nature that pervades the universe. Each being also has this Buddha nature. Buddha nature is the pure, bright, non-conceptual, non-verbal, non-discriminative knowing, but has been polluted by ignorance and conceptual, discriminative knowledge of good and evil. When Buddha nature is purified of karmic pollution, it is liberated and no longer reincarnates. At that point, Buddha nature escapes the body and merges into the pure essence sea, called entering nirvana. This concept is similar to the small self and great self in Brahmanism. The Shurangama Sutra of Mahayana Buddhism advocates for the seeing nature, hearing nature, and knowing nature that are eternal and undying in each being, similar to the soul in Jainism. Chinese Zen Buddhism advocates for the original face. Though it does not use the term soul, it is essentially the concept of the soul in idealistic religions. The concept of emptiness in the Prajnaparamita literature of Mahayana Buddhism explains the world in two aspects: the absolute formless essence and the relative phenomenal world that ordinary beings live in, the material world with forms, birth, and death. From the absolute essence, the relative phenomenal world emanates, and thus the Heart Sutra asserts, form is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form. This concept is equivalent to the great self and small self in Brahmanism. In summary, idealistic religions all conceive of a soul that is the master, owner, and controller of the body and mind. This soul is eternal and undying, and in religions that believe in reincarnation, the soul can transfer from one body to another across lifetimes. Chapter 2. The Buddha denies the self-soul. Throughout his 45 years of teaching, the Buddha repeatedly analyzed and taught that there is no eternal, undying self-soul controlling the body and mind. He affirmed that all phenomena, whether name or form, are non-self. The Buddha used various means to clarify this issue. In the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the Buddha employed a simple yet solid argument based on observable reality rather than mere reasoning. He pointed out that there is no self or ego that is the master, owner, and controller of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. If there were a master self, it would control these aggregates at will. The form aggregate, body, would not age, get sick, or die. Feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness would also be under such control. However, the reality is that the form aggregate is still subject to aging, sickness, and death, proving that there is no self-soul controlling the body and mind. The Buddha demonstrated that all phenomena arise through dependent origination, following the law of cause and effect. Two equal causes contact, then both cease, giving rise to an effect. This effect then continues to act as a cause interacting with another cause, ceasing together and producing a new effect. Therefore, phenomena, whether name or form, are impermanent and transient, with relationships among phenomena being equal, without a master or owner. Thus, all phenomena are ownerless and non-self. Hence, there can be no eternal, undying, self-soul controlling name and form. In the Maha-Nidana Sutta, the Buddha taught that feeling arises due to contact, perception arises due to contact, mental formations arise due to contact, and consciousness arises through the process of contact, feeling, perception, intention, also due to contact. Contact is understood as the interaction of two causes, sense organ and sense object, giving rise to feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Form is defined as the four great elements. Anything formed by the four elements and observed in reality arises from the interaction and mutual cessation of two form phenomena. For example, two form phenomena, hydrogen and oxygen, must interact and cease together to produce water. Therefore, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness arise due to contact and cease due to contact, meaning there is nothing eternal and undying. In the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha frequently reminded and emphasized the need to observe the arising and ceasing of the five aggregates. This is the arising of form. This is the ceasing of form. This is the arising of feeling. This is the ceasing of feeling. This is the arising of perception. This is the ceasing of perception. This is the arising of formations. This is the ceasing of formations. This is the arising of consciousness. This is the ceasing of consciousness. Buddhists should not only memorize but observe reality to clearly see the arising and ceasing of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness as clearly as seeing a mango in the palm of their hand. From there, they can affirm for themselves that there is nothing eternal, permanent, and undying like a soul. The five aggregates are a process of arising and ceasing. At each moment, only one phenomenon arises and ceases. Only feeling and perception arise and cease together. Understanding this, we realize that beings are processes of arising and ceasing in the order of form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness successively. This understanding ends ignorance, the misunderstanding that beings are a solid entity. We also need to observe to understand that in the five aggregates, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Perception and consciousness are the knowing minds that the world mistakenly believes to be the soul. The perception aggregate is the direct knowing mind through the senses, called intuitive knowing mind, responsible for recording or recognizing objects. It is non-conceptual, non-verbal, non-discriminative, including eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and perception consciousness. This direct knowing mind is possessed by humans and animals, present at birth, not acquired through learning, transmission, or accumulation, but arises due to the contact of sense organ and sense object, impermanent and transient. The consciousness aggregate is the knowing mind of consciousness, the indirect knowing mind arising through the process of contact, feeling, perception, intention, different from the perception, aggregate arising due to the contact of sense organ and sense object. Therefore, the consciousness aggregate is conceptual, verbal, discriminative, acquired through learning, transmission, and accumulation. So species and individuals differ, saints and ordinary beings differ. Psychology calls this cognitive perception of objects. The consciousness aggregate is also impermanent and transient. Chapter 3. The ordinary person clings to the self. Ordinary people, whether idealistic, believing in the existence of a self-soul, or materialistic, denying the soul, spiritual world, and reincarnation, live with a self that is the master, owner, and controller of the body and mind. All strive to nurture and exalt this self. However, the self does not truly exist. In reality, ordinary people live with the notion of self-clinging, attaching to form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness as theirs, as themselves. This self-clinging, called the five clinging aggregates, conflicts with the reality of non-self, causing suffering. The Buddha affirmed that the five clinging aggregates are suffering. This clinging manifests in three aspects: I know, mine; I am superior, inferior, or equal. In the scriptures, these are often referred to in Chinese terms as self-view, self-ownership view, and self-conceit. Humanity, from the old to the young, male or female, rich or poor, wise or ignorant, of any ethnicity or religion, lives with this wrong view on the eightfold wrong path. For example, a female student goes to school with beautiful, expensive, unique clothes and receives praise. She feels proud and the awareness of self arises. I am superior. I am the most beautiful. I am the most dazzling. This is self-clinging. Clinging to the beautiful clothes as mine, as me, form clinging aggregate. In reality, it is the clothes that are superior, not any self. Or a research student who earns a PhD lives with the notion, I am superior to those with a master's degree. But in reality, the superiority is clinging to the amount of knowledge, consciousness clinging aggregate, of the PhD being more than the master's knowledge, not that a PhD self is greater than a master's self. Ordinary people live with this self-clinging notion, clinging to form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness as theirs, as themselves, as their self. This wrong self-clinging notion, the five clinging aggregates, conflicts and opposes the truth of non-self, causing suffering. Therefore, in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha affirmed, in short, the five clinging aggregates are suffering. In daily behavior, we can easily see this clinging notion. For example, a female student goes to school with beautiful, expensive, unique, dazzling clothes and receives admiration and praise. She feels very proud, and the awareness arises that she is superior, the most beautiful, the most dazzling. This is self-clinging, clinging to the beautiful clothes as mine, as me, form-clinging aggregate. In reality, it is the clothes that are superior, not any self. A research student who earns a PhD also lives with the understanding that he is superior to those with a master's degree, but in reality, the superiority is clinging to the amount of knowledge, consciousness clinging aggregate, of the PhD being more than the master's knowledge, not that a PhD self is greater than a master's self. Self-clinging is the source of all suffering and affliction. Therefore, understanding and eliminating the notion of self-clinging is an important step on the path to enlightenment and liberation. Chapter 4. Without a soul, self, what reincarnates? The question of what reincarnates when there is no soul self has puzzled Buddhists since the time of the Buddha. Because this question has not been answered clearly and distinctly, most Buddhists and Buddhist sects still attribute the entity that reincarnates to the soul, though expressed in different ways. However, the Buddha and enlightened ones know that liberation, nirvana, is non-existence of both name and form. According to the Buddha, beings are continuous, successive processes of arising and ceasing of name and form over endless time. This name and form cease, giving rise to another name and form in a very short span, continuing endlessly. When a person dies, that name and form ceases, giving rise to a new name and form. This process is called reincarnation. When a person is enlightened, ignorance and craving, the five clinging aggregates, cease. The cycle of reincarnation ends, and there is no existence of both name and form. Today, with the advancement of information technology, we can better visualize this process. Imagine a self-driving car consisting of two parts: hardware, form, and software, name. The self-driving car receives information, processes it, and performs actions like a human driver. It can learn, accumulate experience, and when it reaches the end of its lifespan, its data can be transferred to a new car. This process does not require a soul self to control. Similarly, humans consist of two parts: hardware, which is the physical body structure, form, and software, which is the amount of information, name, including knowledge, experience learned, transmitted, and accumulated. The interaction between name and form with the external world generates the mind of seeing, hearing, feeling, knowing, and leads to speech and actions. The amount of information learned, accumulated, transmitted is called Dharma objects. This Dharma object information, along with genetic information stored in the DNA structure of brain nerve cells, reincarnates, transmitted from the deceased body to a new body, similar to how the data of the self-driving car is transferred to the new car. Therefore, the process of reincarnation does not involve a soul or self, but is the transmission of information from one body to another. When a person dies, their name and form cease, creating the condition for a new name and form to arise. This is a continuous, endless process, with no entity completely perishing. The cause of this process is ignorance and craving due to clinging to form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness as mine, as me, as myself. When a person is enlightened, ignorance and craving completely cease. The cycle of reincarnation ends, and there is no existence of both name and form. This is the state of nirvana without remainder, where the name and form of the person completely cease, with no conditions for a new name and form to arise. It is like sleeping a sound, dreamless sleep forever. To clearly answer the question, what reincarnates, we need to understand that this process is the continuation of name and form, not of a soul or self. By understanding this, we can eliminate self-clinging and move towards true liberation.